The man was shoving a cheap polymer 80 ghost gun into my wife's face, his knuckles white, his breath smelling of stale coffee and desperation. His hands were trembling, his eyes bulging with a pathetic kind of self-importance I hadn't seen since my last trip overseas. Before we dive in, which country are you watching from? Comment down below. This was all happening on our own front lawn, a meticulously kept patch of grass we paid a fortune for, and the inciting incident, the grand crime that warranted a potential death sentence, was that my wife had jogged past the HOA clubhouse without her resident ID card. What this overweight mall cop reject couldn't possibly know, and what I would have paid a year's salary to see dawn on his terrified face, was that the woman he was threatening was a Tier 1 operator who had spent the last 6 months hunting warlords in a place that doesn't officially exist. Her deployment kit, still caked in the dust of a country that doesn't officially appear on any map, sat half unpacked in our spare room. And now, she was standing perfectly still, staring down a wannabe lawman who was chicken-winging his arm and teacupping his grip on the pistol like he'd learned everything he knew from watching bad television. I knew for a fact she could disarm, disable, and hog-tie him with a roll of duct tape and a pine cone in under 3 seconds. But she just stood there. She was analyzing him, her head tilted in a way I recognized from mission briefings right before she'd point out a fatal flaw in a strike plan. He had no idea he wasn't just breaking the law. He was about to become a lesson in what happens when a bully picks the wrong target, and I was going to document every second of his destruction. We chose this neighborhood for the quiet. We were done with war. My wife, Claire, had spent 20 years in the United States Army Special Operations Command, culminating in a position that, on paper, barely exists. I've seen the redacted reports. I know about the hostage rescue she led in the driving rain, the one where she personally neutralized 3 hostiles before the main assault force had even breached the outer wall. She wanted peace. She wanted quiet mornings, a vegetable garden, and maybe, eventually, a few chickens clucking in the backyard. She was done with tyrants. My battlefield was different, but no less hostile. For 15 years, I was a threat analyst for a 3-letter agency you've heard of, specializing in cyber warfare and signal intelligence. My job was to find digital ghosts, state-sponsored hackers, terrorist cells, hostile intelligence networks, and erase them. I dismantled hostile networks from a sterile, windowless room deep underground. I just wanted a finished basement with gigabit fiber for my private cybersecurity contracts, and a place where the loudest noise was the hum of my servers. We thought we'd left the world of despots and fanatics behind. We were wrong. The new tyrant was just smaller, pettier, and lived 3 streets over in a beige McMansion with an obsessive-compulsive fixation on lawn height. We weren't here a week before we met her. Karen Brewster, the HOA president. She was a failed city council candidate in her late 50s who channeled all her bitter ambition into absolute dominion over our 300-home subdivision. She marched up to our door armed with a clipboard and a smile that was all teeth. She introduced her little gang of enforcers as the Home Safety Division, or HSD, a private LLC she herself owned, a detail I'd discover later. The HOA dues, it turned out, were funneled directly into her own pocket to pay for her army of unlicensed, uninsured thugs. They drove around in matte black golf carts with cheap LED light bars zip-tied to the roof, harassing teenagers for skateboarding and measuring the distance between decorative shrubs with a tape measure. At first, I thought it was a joke. Then I realized they were deadly serious. A few of our neighbors had already been crushed by her regime. I'd spoken with a retired Marine colonel who lived down the street. He'd given Claire a knowing nod the first time he saw her. "There's a quiet professionalism about your wife," he told me later. "The kind you don't learn in an office." He was the one who told me about the others. He told me about an elderly veteran on a fixed income, a man who had fought at Khe Sanh, who was fined into oblivion because the shade of beige he'd painted his mailbox was, according to Karen's architectural review committee, a non-compliant hue. She buried him in legal fees, slapped a lien on his house, and eventually forced him into foreclosure. Her own cousin, a man who owned the only HOA-approved landscaping company, bought the property for pennies on the dollar. This wasn't a homeowners association. It was a criminal enterprise hiding in plain sight. And every signature on every predatory fine was a thread I could pull to unravel her entire world. The welcome mat was the final straw. She sent us a violation notice, a crisp letter with threatening red font, stating our simple black welcome mat was non-regulation. It was a power play, a pathetic attempt to establish dominance. That's when I knew diplomacy had failed. That night, I went down to my basement, past the humming server racks, and sat at my command center. Karen thought she was fighting a homeowner. In reality, she was fighting a ghost from the intelligence community. My work began with simple, open-source intelligence. I started with the county tax assessor's public database, cross-referencing property deeds with state business filings. It didn't take long to map out Karen's entire network of corruption. The predatory towing company the HOA exclusively used? The regional manager was her brother-in-law. I found public financial statements for the HOA, legally obtainable by any homeowner, and the numbers didn't add up. Large, recurring payments for community security were being wired not to a licensed security firm, but to her shell company, the Home Safety Division LLC. From there, the money was scattered into various accounts, including one belonging to her landscaper cousin. It wasn't just a kickback scheme, it was textbook wire fraud. While I hunted for digital ghosts, Claire did her own reconnaissance. She spoke to neighbors, collecting stories, documenting every instance of harassment and intimidation. People were terrified of Karen, but they trusted Claire. They saw the quiet strength in her, the same thing the colonel had recognized. They gave her copies of absurd violation notices, recordings of HSD thugs threatening them, and timelines of the abuse. We were building a portfolio, a dossier of criminal activity that would stand up in federal court. I spent 3 straight nights buried in LexisNexis, poring over state and federal statutes. I found laws governing licensed security, the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, and the crown jewel, 18 U.S. Code Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. It's a statute designed to prosecute officials who abuse their authority to violate someone's civil rights. Karen and her fake cops were acting under the color of law of the HOA, and brandishing a firearm to enforce a rule about jogging was a textbook violation. I found the thread, that single wire transfer. That wasn't just an HOA rule violation. It was a felony. And the IRS Criminal Investigation Division has a particular fondness for wire fraud. I had the what. Claire, with her network, was about to provide the how. It was time to make some calls. Feeling the pressure from our formal inquiries and refusal to pay her bogus fines, Karen overplayed her hand. She called a special disciplinary hearing in the community clubhouse, with the stated purpose of publicly shaming us and voting to place a lien on our property. She wanted to make an example of us. The room was packed with residents, some there to support her, others there out of fear, and a few, like the colonel, there to watch the fireworks. Karen stood at a lectern, smug and radiant in her victory. She delivered a 15-minute monologue about the importance of rules, of conformity, of protecting property values from non-compliant elements. Her eyes kept flicking toward us. When she finished, she opened the floor. Claire stood up. The room went quiet. She didn't walk to the lectern. She stood right where she was, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the stale air of the clubhouse. She started by methodically citing the specific HOA bylaws that Karen herself had violated in her vendetta against us. Rules about selective enforcement, harassment, and conflicts of interest. Karen's plastic smile began to falter. She tried to interrupt, to shout Claire down, but Claire's voice never wavered. Finally, Karen shrieked, her voice cracking with rage. "You have no authority here! This is my meeting. You are just a renter." Claire let the accusation hang in the air for a moment before she answered. "My authority," she began, her voice dropping into a register that sent a chill through the room, "doesn't come from a deed or a title. For 20 years, my authority came from the United States Army Special Operations Command, where I planned and led missions to dismantle corrupt, illegal organizations led by petty tyrants who thought they were above the law. My name is Command Sergeant Major Claire Johnson, and your criminal enterprise ends tonight." You could have heard a pin drop. The color drained from Karen's face. The colonel, in the back, slowly stood up and rendered a perfect, silent salute. The power in the room didn't just shift, it shattered. Neighbors who had been cowed into silence were now staring at Karen with open contempt. They weren't looking at a defiant homeowner. They were looking at a decorated American war hero who had just been threatened by their HOA president. Panicked and exposed, Karen did the last stupid thing she could. She pointed a trembling finger at Claire and screamed at her two HSD goons standing by the door, the same ones from my front lawn. "Remove her! Get her out of here now!" She gave the order. Her last shred of plausible deniability vanished. It was now officially assault. That was the signal. That night, I finalized the evidence package. It was a masterwork of digital forensics, a 50-gigabyte, encrypted file containing financial records, sworn affidavits from 20 different families, video evidence of the HSD's illegal activities, and a detailed legal brief I'd written myself citing the specific state and federal codes Karen had violated. A single email was sent to 3 recipients: the Regional Office of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, the State Attorney General's Office for Racketeering, and a trusted contact I still had at a major investigative news outlet. While my digital bombs were being delivered, Claire made one phone call. It wasn't to a general or a politician. It was to a former JAG officer from her unit, who was now a senior prosecutor in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. She didn't ask for a favor. She made a formal statement as a private citizen and an active duty service member who had been a victim of a crime under Section 242 of Title 18 of the United States Code. She gave him names, dates, and locations. Federal investigations don't move fast, but they move with the weight of an avalanche. A week later, the first tremors hit. An investigative journalist showed up at the tow yard owned by Karen's brother-in-law, shoving a microphone and copies of my financial analysis in his face. The next day, the HOA's bank accounts were frozen by the state. Subpoenas were issued. Men in dark suits with badges started quietly knocking on doors throughout the neighborhood, interviewing the families who had given us affidavits. Karen's world was being systematically dismantled, and she didn't even understand the forces that had been arrayed against her. The end came on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't local cops. A team of 4 FBI agents, their jackets emblazoned with yellow letters, rolled up to Karen's beige McMansion in 2 black SUVs. They didn't bother knocking. They executed a no-knock warrant, the same kind of legal instrument used for violent criminals and flight risks. The news cameras, tipped off by my contact, were already on the scene. They captured the entire thing. A bewildered Karen being led out of her house in handcuffs, her face blotchy and streaked with tears, whining about property values as they shoved her into the back of a government vehicle. It was a beautiful sight. The aftermath was total. The on-screen news report that night listed the charges: RICO violations, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and multiple felonies related to operating an unlicensed security firm. The HOA was dissolved by the state and put into receivership. Every fraudulent lien Karen had ever placed was nullified, and in the most satisfying victory of all, a civil settlement forced her to use her own stolen money to buy back the foreclosed veteran's home and return it, deed-free, to his family. 6 months later, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. The black golf carts were gone. The ridiculous rules were abolished. Kids played on the street, and neighbors actually talked to each other. That summer, we had a community BBQ. The retired Marine colonel, the one who had saluted Claire, walked over to where we were standing. He raised his glass of beer. "To the Johnsons," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "for reminding us that sometimes all it takes is one good soldier to win a war." The whole neighborhood cheered, and for the first time since we moved in, we finally had what we came for: peace.